Peter Buswell with Dr. VoIP with a video cheat sheet configuring Cisco ShoreTel SIP trunks. Not sure why so many folks are connecting ShoreTel PBX to Cisco CUCM, but we sure do see a lot of requests for this lately. So I'm going to walk you through how to configure the ShoreTel SIP trunk, how to configure the Cisco trunk, and how to set up your various dial plan options. We're going to start by configuring the SIP tie line. We want to enable ShoreTel in the US to interconnect with a call manager, which happens to be located in Europe, and to enable extension dialing between the two systems. Now, Cisco really doesn't care about overlapping extensions. It has a strategy in dial patterns, partitions, calling search spaces that pretty much enable you to set up a dial plan to do pretty much anything you want. ShoreTel, however, is going to be concerned about any overlapping extensions. So if you have extensions in your ShoreTel that are the same as extensions in your call manager, you're going to have to resolve that. And there are several strategies for doing that. And in fact, that's so interesting. I think we're going to do a separate video just on how to write custom dial plans. But the tool that's instantly available to you in ShoreTel is the um, translation patterns. We'll come back to that. In this configuration, there's no session border controller. So the tie trunk will be directly from the ShoreTel SIP proxy to the Cisco call manager. This will be done over a private IP network through a VPN tunnel. So there's no session border controller. It's probably the simplest configuration, the one that's going to cause you the least amount of troubleshooting challenges because there's no session border controller. The trunk talks to the proxy server at each end. Then we'll log in, configure the SIP trunk on the Cisco. We'll configure the ShoreTel SIP trunk, and we'll test the dial plan. And we'll actually look at the connection from both sides of the system. The Cisco setup involves logging in. We're going to modify the SIP profile for ping. I do this as a standard practice. Anytime I set up a SIP trunk, I modify the SIP profile, the standard SIP profile, copy it and save it as standard SIP profile with ping. And I'll show you how to activate that little option. I find it useful when I log in to see how long the trunk has been up and active. And you get that information by enabling the ping option. We will configure the SIP trunk. We'll set the significant digits for that SIP trunk. And we will also configure a dial pattern that will, when the call manager sees these digits, it'll know to use this SIP trunk. On the ShoreTel side, we'll log in, we'll check SIP resources, and we'll modify the standard tie line SIP profile that ShoreTel provides. It will not work with the call manager. There's various SIP configuration options that you're going to have to configure, change the standard configure to some. I'll share the ones that I know work because I'm using it and it works. Sometimes SIP can be a little bit more of an art than a science, and sometimes you're just going to have to play with these to get it to work. But I'll show you the set that is working between a ShoreTel version 14 and a Cisco Call Manager version 11. We'll create a trunk group, give it an access code, set the OPX extensions. We'll talk a little bit about dial plan overlay and custom dial plans on ShoreTel to address any OPX extensions that might exist in both systems. And then we'll add our individual trunks. Um, and I think at this point, let's just log in and do some configuration. Let's get started by logging into the call manager. One of the first places we want to go, again, we're working with SIP trunks. So the first place I like to go whenever I'm going to set up a SIP trunk is go on down here to Devices, Device Settings, head on over to SIP Profiles. And in here, you're going to find the standard SIP profile. Now, you don't want to customize or change the settings in this standard SIP profile that's provided with your call manager. What you're going to want to do is make a copy of it and do a save as. And this way, you've got your original SIP profile. But what I'm looking to do here is to scroll down here until we get to the SIP options for ping. And what we want to do here is enable this. And I'll show you why shortly. But go ahead, copy this standard SIP profile with option ping. Next place we're going to want to go is go to Device, Trunk, and we're going to set up a new trunk. So I've already set it up, so I'm just going to review the configuration. When you set this up, there's not going to be a route pattern necessarily. You may do that afterwards. Since I've already configured this, it's showing up here, but I'm going to show you how to set up the route pattern anyway. I gave it a name, ShoreTel to France, which is where this call manager is located. And you're basically going to go in. Where you see these asterisks, typically that means it's a required parameter. But go ahead and fill this in for your system, give it a name, select certainly the device pool, media resources, whether you do or do not need a media termination point. I find that a media termination point is typically required, and we'll look at this again on the ShoreTel side. I think the best example I can give you of a media termination point requirement is if you call into the ShoreTel over a SIP trunk and you get an automated attendant, and then you push some digits, 1 for accounting, 2 for support, whatever. When you press that digit, often you'll get disconnected. And the reason for that is there was no place to hang the media when the system goes off to fork the call or refer the call off to the endpoint that you selected. So with a media termination point, you're basically going to hang that media, terminate it at that point, and this way it will enable you to set up other endpoints. Again, sometimes it's more of an art than a science, so you'll have to play with this, and you'll have to play with it on both ends of your connection. In this configuration, I used media termination point on the call manager side. The most important parameter to get this puppy to work is the significant digits. You have to let the call manager know how many digits that are coming its way should be used. Yeah, and I've set this for 4, and we could take a look at what happens if you change this number. With this not filled in or set to default, or 0, it will actually fail. So in this case, we're going to send this trunk 4 digits. And of course, the other parameter is down here in the destination address. So in this case, this is the IP address of the ShoreTel SIP proxy at the other end of this trunk. And you folks out there have never done this before, you want to remember that the SIP proxy is a ShoreGear switch, not the ShoreTel headquarters server. A lot of folks make that mistake. They'll put the IP address of a ShoreTel server in here. It's not a call manager. It doesn't configure that way. You have to put the IP address of the ShoreTel uh, gateway, voice gateway, the little orange box that you set up with SIP trunk resources, and that's what you're going to put in here. And then down here, SIP trunk security profile, set to non-secure. And down here where it says the SIP profile, that's the little goodie I was showing you earlier in which we enabled the SIP ping option. And if we, whoops, let's refresh that, please. So whenever you make a change in a SIP trunk on the call manager, you need to go ahead and hit the reset button. So if you make a configuration change and you try it, it doesn't seem to work, chances are you forgot to reset the trunk. So whenever you make a change, go ahead and do that. So what I want to show you about the ping option here, what you'll see here is normally if you just use the standard SIP profile, this is going to say, unregistered. You're not going to see anything here, and that always causes me a lot of anxiety. So as a standard practice, I set the ping option so I can see the time in full service. And that's what we want to do here. Okay, the next thing we're going to want to do is go to Hunt Route Patterns, and we want to set up a route pattern for routing calls to the ShoreTel. So in this case, we want to dial 51 to indicate to the call manager that we want to send the call across the SIP trunk. So you'll go ahead and add a new one. I've already created it. Basically, what I've done here is to say 51 dot XXXXX. So basically, if you dial 51 followed by any 4 digits, you're going across the SIP trunk. Don't know if there's something on the other side for you to connect to, but from a routing perspective, you dial 51 and 4 digits. We're sending you across that list. And we might change this to 51 dot, maybe exclamation point later if we want to send a bunch of other digits across there. Maybe we want to do tail end hop off on the ShoreTel side. But for purposes of this demo, we're just going to do 4 digits. It's pretty straightforward. The trunk setup here, again, pay attention to the asterisks. They typically require you to fill something in. Now, when we dial these digits, which gateway or route list should we use? Now, in the call manager, most of you know, you can select a route list, which is going to point to a route group and finally to a gateway or 2 gateways. Maybe we've got a VPN gateway plus a PSTN gateway in our route group under this route list. But in this case, we're going to point directly at the trunk or the gateway in this case, right? So there's the trunk that we previously set up. We're declaring this to be on net. And if we go down here to the called party transformation, we want to discard the pre-dot. So if we dial 51, 1, 2, 3, 4, this route pattern is going to discard the 51, the pre-dot, and just send 4 digits. So we've got our trunk set up, we've got our dial plan set up, and obviously you want to make sure that your route partition is correctly defined so that these incoming digits, for example, or outgoing folks have the correct partition in their calling search space to make use of this facility. Okay, so that's pretty much it on the Cisco side. Let's jump in and take a look at the ShoreTel side, and then we'll bring up a couple of phones and see what we got. Okay, the first part of the ShoreTel configuration is just to make sure that you have sufficient resources. And what we're looking for here is a short gear switch that has been configured with at least 5 SIP trunks. So this will be our SIP proxy, and in this case, this will be the switch that we're going to use to tie our call manager to. So we note the IP address because we'll come back to this. The next issue would be to go to trunks, trunk groups, and set up. You're going to set up a new trunk group. Now, I've already set it up in the interest of speed here, but I'll walk you through the configuration. So we gave it a name, and in this case, he created a tie trunk profile. This is a SIP profile. I'll come back to this in a minute because it's probably the area that's most troublesome in these configurations. We've declared the number of digits that we expect to get, 4. We've set this up inbound to treat those as extensions. We do not at this time have a translation table. We may have a translation table. We're allowing tandem trunking. We've given the user group a particular profile. We've set up a default destination. And in this case, you pretty much are going to uncheck everything in the the trunk service options below, except enable the original caller information. Leave that checked. We want to get that information inbound. And we also want the caller ID not blocked by default. So those are the only 2 check boxes you should see down here. And now let's go take a look at this profile. Notice that the digest authentication, we're not using it at all. Typically, you set some kind of authentication on SIP trunks when you're working with a carrier. It's kind of a mixed bag because sometimes you have a username and a password, which is probably a very good practice. But what I've noticed is that a lot of carriers just prefer to authenticate based on the peer. So they're looking at your IP address and saying, yes, if you know this information, this setup request, this invite, etc., is coming from this IP address, we recognize that as legitimate. Now, I guess that's a good strategy. Those of you who are expert, not even experts, high school kids can do IP spoofing, and that would enable someone to spoof your IP address and actually set up a phone call for a trunk that does not use digest authentication. But in this case, we're on a private network. We're talking to a friendly call manager, and therefore we're not going to use any form of authentication. We will use, if in fact, the peer IP address to authenticate. So what we want to look at now is this tie trunk. So if we go to, where did we put that? Go to SIP profiles. You'll see here that ShoreTel ships one called the default trunk profile. And these are the options that are set on this trunk. And then you add your custom options here. And basically you're going to re-enter, let's assume that you want options ping equal to 1. Well, you'd go ahead and enter that here, and that would override this default configuration. What I've done here is to copy this guy and to create a profile that I call the CUCM tie trunk. And here's what that profile looks like. So we do, in fact, want the ping option. We do, in fact, want the don't forward refer. These are SIP setup messages that if you look up here, you'll see they're typically turned off in the ShoreTel standard configuration. Hairpinning, for example, we want hairpinning, so we type it over here again and put in hairpin equals 1. Okay. Yeah, and I guess a real important one that I'll point out, which is not on the ShoreTel list, is this one codec answer. So you'll go ahead and set that to true, or one in this case, and I'll post this profile where you can get all of the details, but I think you can see them here pretty clearly, right? And at that point, we've got a profile that I know works because we're using it. So sometimes, as I pointed out before, it's more art than science, and you have to tweak these little things. And this is the result of using some SIP debug on both the ShoreTel side and the Cisco side. On the Cisco side, if you had a gateway, excuse me, a session border controller, you were setting up your SIP interface to an iOS gateway, your CC SIP debug is really excellent tool there. But since we're terminating directly on the call manager, we're going to have to make use of RTMT and pull logs off the call manager to see the SIP messages. In the case of ShoreTel, we can do a packet capture and take a look. But at the end of the day, hopefully this video is saving you some grief, because here are the parameters that won out in our little test of ShoreTel talking to the call manager. Back over at the trunk group, we're going to I'm going to start by putting an OPX extension. I'm just going to put my test extension in right now. So I've added my test extension at 7289, which is a Cisco IPCC that's registered to the call manager at the other end. I'll show you that in a minute. And we'll use this to test this system. I also have an X-Lite SIP softphone attached to the ShoreTel. Keep in mind that there's some challenges here. Hopefully, you've got a situation in which you can just put in your OPX extension list the extensions or the extension ranges of the extensions in your call manager. You'd list them out here in your off-premise extension. And obviously, anybody that dials that extension will be directed to this SIP trunk, and off you go. The challenge becomes one in which, and by the way, doing that, there's no need to have an access code. So here you see we put in an access code of 51. But if you're using off-premise extensions, you will not need to do that. ShoreTel wants you to put that information in there, but at the end of the day, your ShoreTel users call your Cisco users by dialing an extension that appears in the OPX list, and that's how that. But what are you going to do if the extensions on the other side are the same as extensions in the ShoreTel, or they're of different lengths? You got 4-digit extensions here in the ShoreTel, and you've got, I don't know, 5 or 6 digits in the call manager. Well, then you're going to make use of the translation table. We don't have a translation table necessarily applied here. My goal was to get the tie line working first and then work out the dial plan. Now, in this situation, there's going to be some challenges because the extensions here in the ShoreTel happen to match the same extension numbers in the call manager. So that's going to be a bit of a trick. What I expect to do is to enable a custom dial plan here on this trunk group that will enable me to either A, just dial the access code followed by 4 digits, pretty much the way we did on the call manager side, right? 51 dot, remember that, XXXX. We'll try and replicate that here, or minimally on other systems, I've used a custom dial in which, for example, I'm attaching to a paging adapter and I don't want to output any digits. So there's a custom dial plan option that we can apply there that would say when you dial the access code, or you dial the one OPX extension in this list, do not out dial those extensions. And hopefully the call manager returns dial tone, and then the caller can dial anything they want. We'll test that out. We'll see how it works. But for purposes of this demo, and to prove our configuration, we're just going to put an OPX extension here. Okay, after we have the trunk group set up and our profile applied and our OPX extensions in there, the next thing we need to do is go to individual trunks, and we need to add the individual trunks to that trunk group. So basically, you're going to go here, you're going to say add correct place here, and you're going to select your command. And you're going to say select my trunk group, in this case the tie line that we created. So we're going to add a new trunk at the headquarters site, and we're going to put it in the trunk group that we previously created. And what you're going to do is go down, you're going to just say add, and I've already done that, so I'm just going to show you what we did. We added it, and you're going to select. It's going to ask you to put in the switch that has your uh, SIP proxies. I showed you the SIP proxies, and then you're going to put the IP address here of the call manager at the other end, right? So this trunk SIP proxy is going to connect with this IP address at the other end. And when you're setting this up, it'll actually ask you how many of these do you want to set up. And in this case, I just set up 5, consistent with the 5 that we looked at before. So at this point, let's bring up a couple of test phones and take a look at this configuration, see if it's working in both directions. Okay, let's take a look at whether this configuration all works. So what I have here on the right side of the screen is a Cisco phone. This one, I've done a separate blog on this, and you should check it out. Any of you folks that are Cisco engineers working as I do uh, remotely, for example, the call manager I'm working on here is in France. This system's the ShoreTel's in New York, and I'm out here in Las Vegas, Nevada. And so I'm always working on a VPN connection, and being able to bring up multiple phones, it's just wonderful. This IP Blue soft phone multi-lab enables me to actually bring up 8 copies of this phone, each with a separate audio path. It's a freaking great product. I did a separate blog on this. Please go check that out. But in this case, we've got a single Cisco 7960 phone registered vos options actuelles bis November. There's a lot of French stuff going on here. You can see that the phone is registered as extension 7289, and it's on the call manager in France. And over here, I have an X-Lite soft phone. This is the free version, so I'm getting all these wonderful pop-up ads. I must have purchased about 10 of these from Counterpath, but they make a great product. Bria is the paid version, and you should check it out. But in this case, I've got extension 2085, and it's registered to the ShoreTel. And in the background here, what we have is the ShoreTel trunk test tool, and we're going to use that to demonstrate the configuration. So here on the ShoreTel system, let's dial 7289. Go ahead and dial, and let's see what happens. And you can see the call is ringing in over here. And you can see up here that we've got echo. Let's go with that. At any rate, you can see in the test tool that we're on the SIP trunk connecting extension 2085 to 7285. And I'll go ahead and hang that up. And we can actually do the same thing here. Let's dial an extension I know exists on a ShoreTel.
Votre appel ne peut pas être
Oops, that
acheminé tel qu'il.
extension doesn't exist on the ShoreTel. Let's call 2085. So it's, oh, I forgot the access code, dummy. So it's 5.1, right? We're going to dial 5.1 first, and then we're going to dial 2085. 2085. Oops. Go ahead and dial that. And you can see we grab the call. We see that it's 7289. Um, but I see that it's unknown. I'll have to tweak that. But let's go ahead and hang this guy up. Let's try 51712 and go ahead.
Thank you for calling Drive to Vilbus
Okay,
Healthcare. We
so
appreciate your business.
we can see that the configuration does work. So I'm going to drill down now on some dial plan configurations in ShoreTel to address um, overlapping extensions. I'll probably do a separate video on that because it's a big subject in ShoreTel. But what you've seen here, guys, is that we were able to configure a SIP trunk across a VPN in a private IP space between Cisco and ShoreTel. ShoreTel's version 14.2 and Cisco's version 11. I hope you have found this informative, and thanks for viewing.